Awesome. So we'll go ahead and get started. And people are obviously welcome to keep filtering in as they want. But welcome to our presentation on creative arts therapy. We both work for an organization in the Chicagoland area, but my goal today is really to give you kind of an overview on the creative arts therapy as a whole, so that no matter where you are, whether it's internationally or on the other side of the country, you feel empowered to find a creative arts therapist in your area. So we're going to kind of give you an overview of all of those different things. We're going to start with, what is creative arts therapy? I know some of us might be familiar. I know a couple people have filtered through and said, oh, my child did art therapy when they were a kid. But for some people, maybe it's something you've never even heard of. We're also going to, of course, you want to know why it applies. So we're going to talk about supporting strengths, but also addressing challenges with DCC. And what would a presentation on the arts be without a couple of examples? We want you to be able to relate to what we're talking about. So we're going to give you a couple case examples from our own experience. And then, of course, this is, a lot of our attendees today are parents and family members. So we want to talk about supporting the support system as well, because I know it's a big strain on everybody else to pull all of that information together. So my name is Trisha, and I work for Institute for Therapy Through the Arts. I'm a board-certified music therapist. I also hold a certification in neurologic music therapy. I have been working for several years, and I have experience literally throughout the lifespan. I think my youngest client has been 4, and technically the oldest person I worked with was over 100, but I say 94 because that's my most regular clientele. But I've worked in the school settings, private practice, but worked extensively with individuals with developmental disabilities, including DCC.
And I'm Nolan Sheets. I am a art therapy intern at ITA. I recently finished my studies at Adler University with their Masters of Counseling and Art Therapy program. So I'm just finishing up my hours before I take the exam for my licensure. I've been a part of ITA for about a year now, coming up on a year. I've worked with a variety of therapists there. I've worked with Trisha in the past. I've worked with some of our drama therapists. I've co-treated with other music therapists as well. I have a lot of experience working with kids in schools, even before I started my program at Adler. I was an art teacher for a long time. I was also a private tutor for a long time. And I've gotten a lot of my private practice experience through ITA and a lot of individual client work through ITA as well.
I'll just say that we like him so much that we are keeping him, so.
Recently hired, yes.
Recently hired, so. I know a lot of you, like I said, are from all over the place. But for those of you who are in the Chicagoland area, we do want to give you just a little bit of information so you know where we're coming from and kind of what it is that our organization represents.
Yeah, so ITA has been a part of the Chicagoland area since 1975. The first location was definitely much more central in Chicago. I think it was off of Michigan, really in the city, serving a lot of outreach. It started and still serves as a private practice, and was much more private practice centered when it first started. It uses a lot of expression and creativity through art, drama, dance movement, and music. A lot of our clientele is definitely centered around children and younger clients. We serve a lot of families as well. We have a range of diagnoses that we serve that we'll get into on the next slide that kind of breaks down a lot of the populations that we work with. We recently have been working in CPS schools much more often through a grant, and that was given to us through Special Olympics. And so clients that we serve and classrooms that we serve are either music therapy, dance movement, art. I don't think we have drama in the schools yet, but we will go to different CPS schools and have sessions with a lot of clients and work with other community partners as well outside of the schools. We have some inpatient groups that we serve in different hospital settings. We also work in residential homes with older clienteles, a lot that have progressed dementia, some aphasia from strokes, things like that. and just a wide range of clients that we do serve throughout the Chicagoland area. Even though we're located in Evanston now, we serve a very, very large area.
Yeah. So this is from our most recent annual report. I know like graphics are super tiny when you see them broken down this way, but the biggest thing that I want to just take away is that we work across the lifespan. Again, it's kind of what I was pointing out, a lot of that younger age group here, multicultural, multiracial, and then down here, the 2,500, that's with our neurologic and developmental disabilities. So that is probably one of the largest populations that we do work with. And we're very familiar. We talk a lot about holistic treatment in what we're doing, because when we think about working with someone, as you know, it's all about the treatment team, whether that's the parents if we're working with a child, whether that's coordinating with the related services, OT, PT, speech. We all know all the different therapies, and we work really well and really complementary with them, and we'll keep talking about that as we go through. So now we're gonna just kind of dive in. What is a creative arts therapist? So the biggest thing that I want you to take away from this is that in order to be a creative arts therapist, we go through a lot of training and education around how to use the arts in a therapeutic medium, right? So if you look here, almost everybody requires a higher degree. Music therapy is the exception, but we compensate by having like twice as many training hours. We all have to go through a 6-month internship. At least some are, Nolan has been doing ours for a year. So with supervised clinical training, we have to take foundational courses in psychology, human development, but of course we have that arts component as well. That education piece is absolutely essential. We have a lot of people that relate beautifully to the arts. I'm sure there's probably every person in this room can think of at least one art medium that they can either appreciate or have some experience with. But the difference between being impacted by the arts and working with a creative arts therapist is that we're also trained how to recognize harm. We often don't think about arts as being capable of causing harm, like what's so bad about listening to a song? How could that hurt someone? But what we've learned over countless research and through working even just with our communities is that arts actually has an incredible potential to create as much good as it can cause harm. Those of you who are in the room maybe can even think from that auditory perspective as a music therapist, right? Noise sensitivity. What about playing a song that might be really triggering for someone? Whether it's a song that was played at a family member's funeral. We work a lot also, adults with addiction. There are a lot of associations that our brain naturally makes with different kinds of music at different points in our lives. And so being aware how to recognize harm when it occurs through the arts and being able to respond to that is something that we have a lot of training in. A lot of related professions kind of like to advertise that they provide art therapy or music, healing drum circles. And those are okay. We want people to engage in the arts and create connection there, but I highly encourage you, look who's doing the facilitation. We are working really hard on advocacy and really clarifying so that we don't have people that are not credentialed and not trained doing these groups and not recognizing when they may be causing harm to someone. I know the same can be said for art as well.
Yes, especially with material choices, I think a big one, and a lot of the times that can be a very nuanced decision depending on who you're working with. When we go through foundations later on, I'll dive a little more into it in terms of how material choices worked. But there can be a lot of sensory aversion to certain materials that can be very unexpected with a lot of clients, where if you present someone with a very uncontrollable media, let's say paint, that can be very difficult to deal with and can present a lot of issues with emotional regulation, bringing up past traumas, things of that nature. So the training involved is very extensive, and it goes a lot into, if a client is presenting this way, if there is a certain diagnosis, which art material and which media is going to serve them best, and how do we introduce that art material and that media to serve them best? Which is kind of a concept that can go through all 4 modalities that ITA works with, whether it's drama, art, music, dance. we have directives in certain media and modalities that the implementation of that is so crucial to how the client progresses through therapy and how we meet these therapeutic goals that are often met through other traditional therapies, whether it's talk therapy, CBT, behavioral. There's a lot of these goals that the creative arts attempts to tackle through a different approach that allows for much more self-expression and much more creativity and much more accessibility. Perfect.
Yeah. So I will say that we're not having this conversation to scare you away from the arts. Like,
No.
please engage in arts on your own.
Yes.
But we do want to kind of also give some background on where we're coming from. So I'm excited because the next part of the presentation is why you're all here. What is it about the creative arts that works so well with DCC? Why are we a good medium? What are some strengths and takeaways that you can have when you're seeking services for yourself, for your child? Before we do that, does anybody have any questions about, yes?
Yeah, I did. Regarding, you'll have to go back, but the chart where you had the trend from early age to then going into adulthood, what is the reason for, or do you know the reason or the correlation behind why there's a lack of elders or adults doing creative art therapy?
Yes, so because this was taken from our most recent annual report, if you look at the ones from prior to this, it's actually a much more even. In some cases, we had more adults than children. Because we signed on with the CPS grant, we're working so much in the schools right now, so that school age population just shot up. So a lot of it has to do with where we're contracted. Before we signed on with CPS, we actually, one of the biggest populations that we served was older adults, geriatrics. One of the largest programs that we run, which is one of the programs that I coordinate, is called Musical Bridges to Memory, where we work with adults with dementia and their loved ones and helping connectivity through music. But that's a very, very good question. Prior to 2023, a lot of what we were doing actually was with teens to adults.
All right, perfect. And is that report on your guys' website?
It is.
Yes,
Yep.
and previous years are as well.
All right,
Yep.
thank you.
Yeah.
Any other questions, whether it be about ITA or about the creative arts therapies? Okay. So, common challenges. Did you want me?
So a lot of common challenges that are faced with the creative arts therapy and with other DCC diagnoses that we have found throughout our time in the field is motor coordination and development. We definitely address these through multiple different modalities. I think a lot of motor coordination and development gets aligned with movement therapists and dance movement therapists, which is not necessarily the case, where art therapists, depending on media choice, definitely tackle this as well with a lot of kinesthetic movement, kinesthetic material. Music therapists can also do this as well by incorporating movement into the music they undertake. Sensory sensitivities is a large one that we deal with as well. Kind of that sensory aversion that I was talking about previously. It takes time building that relationship and that rapport with the client to understand which sensitivities the clients have, what material they're adverse to, whether it's sound sensitivity, texture sensitivity, light sensitivity. There's so many different ones that the arts can really benefit and also harm that we talked about earlier. And it's a challenge to work with clientele and work with families and parents of clientele in order to identify those and adapt our sessions and our material so that we are meeting those sensory sensitivities and that we're not doing harm and we're actually doing good. Communication and socialization is a big one as well. A lot of my clients that I do have through ITA are group sessions. And so the arts, whether it be any of the modalities, is a great way of communication, especially non-verbally and in a social setting. I run teen groups. I also am in the process of developing a preteen group as well. And I have some residential group facilities with geriatric populations that are also groups. These are huge to build a community and to build socialization skills and give them a space to express themselves in a way that does not force them to verbalize with one another or even the therapist. There are sessions that I have with certain clients where sitting alongside each other, making art with the entire time, is enough to enhance their socialization skills, where they are terrified to even verbalize or communicate with anyone outside of that session. Or just witnessing someone in the process of being creative is huge for their confidence and huge for their communication skills, where it gives them a space to have a therapist or another group member in session witness something that they have created and witness that process that can sometimes be frustrating as well as rewarding. Where a saying that we have in the creative arts therapy, especially as an art therapist, is it's the process, not the product. And so while there may be a product that comes in, if it's a painting or something that they've been working on through session that we're really proud of, it's important to highlight that as well, especially in a group setting, and share that with other group members. But it's also really important to highlight any challenges that they've been through, any struggles that they had while making this art piece, and highlight the creativity that they put into that art piece, and letting them know that they are being witnessed and heard while creating this art piece, even if it's not verbally expressed by them. Executive functioning, so planning, insight, emotional regulation, processing, all these executive functions are really important when it comes to creativity. There's a lot of planning involved, and it's these nuances that are important within session. A lot of insight, the emotional regulation, emotional recognition, the processing of what is being made while in a creative space. These are all really important to discuss and hold space for in a creative arts therapy session. And when these are at least engaged in a creative way, it allows for not so much of a clinical aspect, or not so much of a quantitative aspect to look at how they're creating art in a space that is important and empowering to them and is being witnessed by others around them. And these are all done through, whether it's planning your art material, planning songwriting, planning a narrative piece that you're doing through drama therapy. These can provide insight and can provide executive functioning that maybe isn't recognized or enhanced outside of session, and that a lot of art modalities answer and can embolden and empower while in session. Self-regulation and coping skills is one that is another challenge to face, and one that comes from many different diagnoses as well, where I think many people, and I'm guessing a lot in here, have engaged with the creative arts therapies in a non-therapeutic way, whether it's painting, whether it's music, drama, and the regulation and the coping skills and a lot of relief that comes with that. And so we like to teach our clients and tackle these skills in a creative way that isn't aligned with other therapy modalities, in a much more creative and safe space to allow them to explore those options, whether it's kinesthetically, if it's through clay and getting really physical with clay, and not necessarily focusing on the product, but focusing on the movement and the aggression, and taking out some of this frustration and some of these movements into the clay. It can also be done through music, where maybe there isn't so much experience with art or through music, and that can be a big barrier, but it can be very regulating and a coping skill to express yourself by wailing on the drums as loud as you can, and being able to let that go and do that in a space that you feel safe and heard in, and that you know the therapist with you can hold that emotion in that space for you in a safe way.
Yes.
May I go back to and ask a question about sensitivity, sensory sensitivity?
Yeah, absolutely.
You touched twice or three times on identifying how this can be harmful and using the right media. Can you address in therapy alleviating a sensitivity?
Yeah.
I have a granddaughter who is total ACC at age 3, and just recently became terrified of the ceiling fans. This was never an issue before, but in 1 week, it was the ceiling fans, and the meltdown was, you could see
Yeah.
terror because the fan was on. And we had a balloon bouquet from a birthday party, and that motion, she was having these meltdowns. We need to have the ceiling fans on now, and we're working to, this makes Nana cool, her other grandmother. We need to do this. Can that be addressed? Reversing sensitivities be addressed through these therapies?
So the question is about, can we support kind of decreasing dysregulation with sensory sensory items, or whether it's visual, whether it's auditory. So that is one of the things that we can work on, especially that's why we include the parent, that's why we include the family. So it's called, building that distress tolerance. Also trying to figure out where, kind of that association of where did this new sensory avoidance come from? Is it like trying to identify, is it the spinning motion that's dysregulating? Is it the sound of the fan that's dysregulating? So that is something that we do tackle a lot. I've worked with clients before that through, for example, like a traumatic brain injury or through other neurological conditions, have some of that auditory sensitivity. And so we've worked a lot on some of that distress tolerance and building up, a little bit at a time and figuring it out not only how they can cope with that sound, but also figuring out where that came from. And sometimes, I think we're coming very much from a strength-based approach as well. So sometimes there are some things that are going to be dysregulating that aren't going to go away necessarily. So one of the things that we might do is teach a coping skill to help them feel regulated when those things are going on. Fans are going to be all around us, even if you took all the fans out of your house, right? So if it is the sound, if we can provide some support in finding comfortable earplugs, or if it is the visual sensation, some things that they can do to self-regulate so that that fan is not going to, cause a total meltdown. We talk a lot about sensory sensitivities, and I'm gonna dive more into this in a little bit, but the part with the sensory sensitivities too is that it's not always avoidance, right? Sometimes we need sensory seeking. We have a lot of people that come in and just a lot of those explosive behaviors and a lot of that dysregulation comes from not getting enough sensory input. And so what we do is we can create a space where we are, meeting those needs and creating opportunities for them to really dive in to a sensory experience that they may not have access to outside of a session. And then, of course, the goal of all therapy, whether it's talk therapy, OT, PT, is to generalize those skills. So once we go through that process in therapy, part of that is also coordinating with the family and talking about, how can we take what we do in session? It's not going to be perfectly the same because that therapeutic relationship is key, but how can we help translate that into your everyday life, right? So when we say sensitivities, I want to, touch on, yes, we're aware of that defensiveness and some of that sensitivity piece, but we're also talking about sensory seeking behaviors as well. I think that is one of the number one things that I see is that split between there are some things I really don't like, but the things I like, I need a lot of. And we're going to talk a little bit about why that is, and we're also going to talk a little bit about how we support those. The other thing that I want to say about executive functioning and self-regulation is, there are spaces, there are times, depending on the individual, depending on the group, that this is a very literal experience. We are breaking it down for them and building those skills. But a lot of times, one of the reasons that people come to the arts is because a lot of this happens without the person even having to be completely aware that we're engaging these skills. We're not going to say, today we're going to write a song together, and that will engage your executive functioning, right? We're going to go through, and for them, it's just a really fun activity. It's a fun experience for them. But what we know is that we're actually hitting on a lot of these things that we're trying to support, and we're trying to kind of mitigate some of these challenges. So I think that's one of the big draws. I have so many clients that they come to therapy because they're like, well, it's fun. And so there's kind of that double-edged sword of, we're actually meeting a lot of goals, and we're doing it in a way that's a little bit more exciting, I guess, than some of, we work a lot, for example, with PT, OT, those, related fields. And one of the things that I notice is, if I'm working with a physical therapist and we have to like step up a stair and back down 40 times, that's exciting. That can be fine, right? Those are important skills, but it's a lot more fun to do that when it's accompanied by a really good song or a good beat that we can either create together or, target with client preferred music. So we're going to keep talking about, those challenges, but as we're doing that, one of the things that I want to point out is that even though we're talking about creative arts therapy and we're presenting this, just kind of broadly, I also want to point out our own bias as well, right? So just like a talk therapist, we are going to be informed by our own philosophical orientation. I love the big words, but basically how we view what we do, right? So how I approach music therapy might be very, very different than someone else. We are all trained the same, essentially, more or less, but I want to just point out that the views that we're representing today are very much, kind of held by ITA and, very centered in how we approach the work, but there are different therapists that will do it differently. I tend to orient myself as a very humanistic and relational therapist. So for me, I really, really care about who the person is. I'm very strength-based. It's less about let's get rid of this problem and more about let's support your skills and your strengths so that you can better face those challenges. I care very much about when I look at a person, I am thinking about what is their the intersectional identity. What is the cultural background? What is the family dynamic like? What is their school environment like? We're thinking about the whole picture. Same thing with that relational piece. I want to know who that person is. What is their special interest? What is the thing that they just love to do, and how can I incorporate that into my work? Not everybody's going to do that, so I do want to point that out. It is important to know kind of what orientation the person is coming from. We have a lot of therapists, especially, I guess, in my field. I put neurologic music therapy down there. It is a training that I have, and it is something that I use, but in that, for some people, NMT is the only way to do music therapy, and it's very rehabilitation-based. We are going to build these skills. I'm going to set a tempo at this pace, and we're going to do a skill at a very specific way. So everyone's going to do it a little bit differently. We have people that are more behavioral in their approach. We have some people that are very, again, very skill building, very technical. And then we have, more of, I think, ITA's general orientation is that of being a little bit more humanistic and a lot more strengths-based. So it's going to change from therapist to therapist. So it's good to be aware of that as you're seeking services. Is that a hand? Yes.
Yeah. Thank you. Just thinking about the different approaches that you just mentioned, what would you say is the overarching common goal of creative arts therapy?
I will say, so the question was a little bit about, what is the overarching goal? And I would say that, a lot of creative arts therapists that I meet, we all tend to agree on the arts as a form of expression and being able to honor individuality. The more of the technical piece, the orientation, I think, more depends on how the session is facilitated and what goals are being addressed. So creative arts therapists, we are all, just like a lot of your other traditional therapies, we still create goals and we are delivering treatment. And so some of the goal writing might be a little bit different from person to person, but we also, collaborate a lot with the family on that to know what's important to you, what's important to the client. We love to keep the client involved. It's almost necessary, if possible. But I would say that creative expression, I think, is going to be central no matter who you work with, but knowing a little bit about how they do therapy, I think, is important. And that's the same as if you see a talk therapist. Knowing what their background is, if someone is, they should hopefully be able to tell you that, all right? So if you're talking about more of that talk therapy that is a cognitive behavioral therapist, they have a very specific way in which they're going to facilitate a session. So just kind of pointing that out. But either way, we're still, across the board, creative arts therapists, are going to use the music, the art, the drama as the medium to meet those goals. I would say 99.9% of the time, I don't want to say 100% of the time, the goals that we're approaching are not arts-based. Once in a while, it makes sense. But overarchingly, the goals that we're addressing have to do with self-expression, coping skills, fine and gross motor movement. So a lot of the goal areas that we address, which we're going to get into in the next slide too, are very much based on how we use the arts to approach non-music goals. So I think that's an important thing that I forgot to mention earlier. Does that answer your question? Yeah. Okay. The last thing I will say before turning it back over to Nolan is a little bit about the neurologic music therapy techniques. So I love what I'm going to say NMTs for short. It is an incredibly well-researched technique of music therapy that looks explicitly at how music and rhythm and beat impact neurological processing. So that can look many different ways. Everything from speech rehabilitation to speech building even, joint attention, working on gait training. So if you're aware of like thigmataxis, right, or leaning against the wall a little bit, having a difficult time with ambulating down the hallway, research shows that with a steady rhythmic stimuli, again, we do a lot of, we are trained to calculate exactly what pace that should be. With a steady rhythmic stimuli, there is a significant increase in one's ability to organize their walking pattern. When it comes to speech rehabilitation, if you are familiar with, I think it was a congresswoman, Gabby Giffords, yeah? So she had an injury to the left side of her brain, which is primarily where we house language. She relearned how to speak through what's called melodic intonation therapy, which is one of the techniques covered in NMT. And so basically what we do is a lot of individuals that are non-speaking have a difficult time accessing that left hemisphere, right? So through melodic intonation therapy, we teach you to talk through singing. Because of the way music is networked neurologically in the brain, it activates both hemispheres. It also activates the corpus callosum. It activates areas all across the brain. And so when we're engaging in singing, we're able to sometimes articulate things that we may not be able to do through speech alone. And what we do is we slowly take away the music until it's speech, right? So I think there's an aphasia group also that talks about, he's like, the secret is I'm always singing, right? So we do a lot about, working through speech and some of that very technical. So for those of you who are very much, I want to see the research, NMT is definitely one of those things I think is going to appeal a lot just because it can really break down step by step. How is the thing that my therapist is doing, how is that impacting my child's brain, and how is it working to strengthen that like anatomical piece? So we can talk about that if there are questions, but I want to, of course, hit on some of those art-based things as well.
Yes, and I think just arts-based in general, I'll start with the expressive therapies continuum. While this was developed by Linda Hintz, who is an art therapist, it is very foundational for all the expressive modalities, and I know Trisha uses it often with her work in music therapy. There are other drama therapists and art therapists at ITA that also use it. And this is a framework and a foundation that is a developmental hierarchy of how we interact with certain material and how we choose certain interventions to use. And it's all based around creativity, bridging the gap between this developmental hierarchy that is it is in 3 levels with 2 sides to each level that are, while they are complementary, they're also somewhat opposite. So the bottom starting level of this expressive therapies continuum has kinesthetic on one side and sensory on the other. And so if this was to be applied from an art therapist perspective, kinesthetic is very movement based. It's very early on in the developmental stage where we are focused on this movement and this expression through moving our limbs, through working with clay is a big kinesthetic one, being able to imprint on clay, using big motions with big material through it. This can also be applied to musical instruments. Drums are very kinesthetic. Their larger instruments are very kinesthetic. And this is a very ground level developmental access point for a lot of clients that may not have that cognitive ability to process and being able to verbalize what they are going through. And so kinesthetic is on one side while sensory is on the other. also a very ground level, very sensory experience where we are focusing on what the material and sensations are doing. We're focusing on lighting, we're focusing on sound, we're focusing on the tactile, very sensory oriented, and knowing what material and how it interacts with the client and how they're able to express themselves through that, which goes a lot with kinesthetic movement, whether it is choosing an instrument or choosing a material. These big movements come accompanied with a certain sensation that comes with it. And while this is ground level, the reason it's a hierarchy is because this kinesthetic and sensory, it applies to the other levels as well. So then the second level, let me look at my notes real quick, would be perceptual and affective. And so perceptual is, while it may sound very visual, and perception is a lot of times tied to visual, it is the formal elements of the material that someone is working with. And so when it's art material, it can be line, form, shape. These different quote-unquote formal art elements are very perceptual in how a client interacts with them. And this can also be applied to music as well, where it's choosing an instrument, choosing the size of an instrument, whether it's multiple instruments at once, very few instruments at a time. It's this perceptual and this perception of what we're working for, where affective is on the other side of that, on the same level, where they interact with each other, and it's very much the emotions that are being evoked by what we're working with and how those emotions present themselves in what they're doing. And this can all be done non-verbally as well. So if a lot of emotions are being evoked, this can be, at least through art, can be seen through color choice, through the perforation and how aggressively one is using a pencil or a pen on paper. And those two often go with each other because it is aligned with that. Those formal art elements are tied with how they are expressed through the emotions of what one is working with. Top very level, cognitive and symbolic. So cognitive is kind of that logical that I was talking about earlier, that being able to process and formulate what you are going with and what you are doing within the directive or the modality that you're working with. And it's very step process oriented, being able to be detail oriented about what is going on. Symbolic are the elements of it that are, it's often quoted as mythical, but very more imaginative and being able to formulate narratives or being able to use your imagination and creativity in ways that are much more abstract and much more ungrounded, and being able to apply those to your artwork or your music or your drama or the narrative story and movements that you're doing, if they're much more chaotic or if they're much more logical. And the reason it goes up in that hierarchy is creativity is in the middle, bridging all of these together at every level in order to help those interact. And while they may be opposites of each other, they also are very complementary. And those baseline developmental levels work their way up through all the others and create a continuum that helps inform many creative arts therapists how they interact with their client and what materials they do based on diagnoses.
I think the cool thing about the ETC, and the reason that we're referencing this today, is those of you that have children with DCC know that developmental milestones are something that you sometimes have to wait a long time for. Some of those milestones might not be hit at any point in time. So one of the great things, we talk a lot about accessibility of the arts. We have foundational knowledge of that, and we know what to look for developmentally. Maybe going in and composing in orchestras is not a good place to start if the first thing we need to do is engage the senses, right? So we're looking at it from a very developmental standpoint. Neurologically, the ETC, those kind of parallel processes that we're going through actually represent left and right brain functioning. So that creativity that runs through the middle, a lot of research shows that when you're engaging in the arts, music has a lot of research on this, and I know they're still building in other fields as well, but it activates neurons in the corpus callosum. So this is a really interesting kind of way to stimulate brain activity, which also ties into the bilateral stimulation.
Perfect segue. The bilateral stimulation, especially through art making, I'm much more familiar with, is using material and interacting with material that activates both sides of the hemisphere and is usually done while music may be both sides at the same time. Bilateral stimulation through art making is often that creative processing and that creative process and that imaginative and working with material activating one side of the brain, and then that processing through with a therapist that is trained in art therapy and being able to at least recognize the elements of what a patient is making, what they're going through, activates the other side of the brain as well. And so this bilateral stimulation has been shown to show activation through the corpus callosum while you're going through that processing with the therapist of how they're choosing their material that they want to work with and what they are creating with it. And through creative arts specifically, it's more of an emotional expression in processing those emotions that can bridge those two as well, where a lot of processing the emotions and expressing emotions in talk therapy and CBT and other modalities can be very difficult to verbalize and can be very difficult to even express to someone that you are not have that rapport with, have that built relationship with, where bilateral stimulation gives an avenue to be able to create your artwork and do it in a way that is safe and being able to process it in a way that is comfortable with the client and that is in the care of a therapist that is able to recognize that process as well.
Yes, question.
Both my parents, while I was growing up, were professional musicians.
Very cool.
My mom, who's here today, she's in another session. She is a professional pianist, and I'm just wondering, so if the corpus callosum can, like, if there are like neurons that can help with, like, stimulate the pathways and everything, like, how do you choose like an instrument that can like work with the corpus callosum?
Okay, so the question was about how do you stimulate the corpus callosum? How do you make instrument selection? How do you make choices that are going to target that specifically, yeah? So I think a lot of that depends on the individual and it depends on exactly what you're targeting. But a lot of that's going to happen through not necessarily instrument selection, but how you're utilizing it. So, for example, if you're a pianist, you said your parents are professional musicians, when you engage in right and left hand simultaneously, first of all, I'm still working on my own piano skills. Like, it takes some time. But those are things, automatically when you're doing, both sides of the body and engaging, and you're reading music, you're automatically engaging so many parts of the brain. So the cool thing about music in particular is that it's gonna shift what brain activity is activated depending on how you're using it. So if you're just listening to music is going to light up different areas of the brain than actively engaging in music making. So, for example, one thing that I do a lot, that's a very accessible thing, is, grabbing drums. We do a lot of improvisation. So there's so much that can happen when we typically start at something a little more unstructured, right? So just like find a beat, right? And we'll all start together, and then as people start to engage creatively or, start to, maybe we'll ask them to like think about representing something, but you can't say what it is, right? Maybe it's walking through the park. Maybe it's representing an emotion. As you begin to engage, and that goes really well with that ETC as well, of being symbolic. As you engage these different levels, those different brain functionings, that's where you're going to start to see engagement and that communication on both sides. So it's less about instrument choice and a lot more about how the music is being used. Performing and engaging in music is going to be a lot different than listening receptively. But it is going to depend person to person because we also want to be mindful that not everybody's going to become a world famous pianist in a day. So we're not necessarily teaching music skills. So a lot of it can just be very exploratory. But typically when we're engaging both sides of the body, right hand, left hand, and then engaging in that some of that cognitive processing as well, you'll see that communication naturally happening.
Because I have partial ACC, and I couldn't, like, when I was younger, I don't know about now, but when I was younger, I couldn't even like read music.
Yeah. So, you mentioned that, you have partial ACC, which I appreciate you sharing and talking a little bit about learning an instrument is hard. So the cool thing about creative arts therapies is you do not have to have an arts background. The amount of times I've had someone say, I am not musical, I don't play an instrument, that is a-okay. We are not teaching you how to read music. I don't know if a single one of my clients right now can read sheet music. It's more about, we hold that knowledge for you. We might have you play the piano, but we're not having you perform a piece. We're having you explore it with me. I might play something and you can just play the notes, whatever you want. So the amount of executive functioning that is required of learning an instrument, reading the sheet music, and performing is it's a lot. It's a lot for me. It's a lot for anyone, right? So what we're doing is we're breaking that down. We're not asking you to read the sheet music. We're gonna find whatever functional level is accessible to you and then build up from there. So it's less about teaching an instrument and more about music exploration and using that medium to find ways for you to engage those skills and be musical without necessarily having to have that technical background.
And that's, translated very well to art as well, where that bilateral stimulation and very much perceiving art as opposed to engaging with art activates different parts of the brain, where it's very exploratory, where bilateral stimulation occurs with whatever material you choose using both hands, and sometimes that involves hand over hand with some clients I have, depending on mobility, of having a pen in each hand, a giant piece of paper, and just creating random lines and seeing what comes of it, as long as both hemispheres are being activated and both sides of the body are. That can be done with clay. That's why the modalities work so well, is that these processes and brain functions can translate really well.
And I guarantee you that across all four of them, 90% of the sessions that I do not look like your Western idea of what art and music are.
Yeah.
The amount of things that we do in session that are completely deconstructed from the idea of a classical music performance it's completely separate from that. We're using musical elements. We're not necessarily teaching musical skill. Now, I recognize, I kind of made jokes about this at the very beginning for those of you who were struggling in, this is a couple days into the conference now, this is a lot of technical information. So I want to let you know that this is our technical slide. After this is where we're going to start to break it down and hopefully make it a little more fun. Because I know this is a lot more of that technical side, but it also builds us the foundation so you have a little bit of orientation as to what we're talking about. So I want to dive more into the application, because this is why we're here. Great, now you know about some of the methodology behind it, the developmental structures, the neurological components, but this is why we choose the arts. This is why people come to us instead of coming strictly to talk therapy, strictly to OTPT. We tend to supplement. Yes, question.
Yeah, sorry, I just had a question with the foundation.
Absolutely.
Slide. Because I really appreciate you saying it's like that, because we're always told like you have to date a therapist.
Yeah.
Kind of thing to figure out if you're a good fit. So based on the content that was on that foundation slide, out of all of that, what do you think is like the number one thing you would say to an adult sibling or to a guardian or to somebody with ACC or DCC? What would be the number one thing you would say in regards to foundations that you need to be considering when looking into giving this service?
So the question is, what is the number one thing you would say to a family member or to a person with DCC when choosing a creative arts therapist? Yes?
Yes.
I think, to be honest, it really does go back to who is the person you're working with. Even if I was a very behavioral therapist, I think personality and just connection that way, it is a little bit, talk about, would you say dating your therapist? You got to kind of find that natural chemistry. I really do think that the personality, I think, is the biggest, what are your goals? Is this someone that you feel is going to help you meet your goals? So it really does come back to who the person is. And we, ITA does intake in a way that, we try to make that connection for you. We make a recommendation based on what we learn about you. But ultimately, just like in talk therapy, you have ultimate veto power. If you're not meshing with someone, we want to find someone that's going to see you as you want to be seen and meet your goals in a way that you want to have them met. Does that make sense? Is that good? Yes.
I think relationship to modality is a big one for me as well.
Yes,
and
that's true.
who is seeking services, and going off that intake process is we do an extensive intake of working with each one and seeing if the client gravitates towards music, art, drama. I think that's really important as well, where you have these relationships outside of a therapeutic space with music and art, but inside that space and during an intake session, I think is really important to discover with the client and what they feel is going to give them and meet the goals that they have in mind for therapy as well. And so their relationship specifically to those in the therapeutic space, I think, is very important, at least from my point of view.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So we're talking about the application piece. No matter what the modality, we say modality a lot, that's the art, the dance movement, music, or art. No matter what that is, these are things that are common across all of the creative arts therapies. These are kind of some of the foundational goal areas that we address. Okay, so we are going to change from modality to modality of how we do this, which we'll give a couple of examples from art and music, because that's our background. But these are ultimately some of, I guess, the more applicable to the challenges that we listed earlier. The self-expression piece, I think, is one of the most important. It's one of my favorite as well, because so often when you are an individual who requires a lot of support and requires a lot of routine, there's a lot of rigidity that comes with that. How often is a space created where you have full autonomy over what that looks like? Whether it's the way it's structured, where you can truly explore, and through that exploration in your relationship with a therapist, you're able to kind of access some of that expression. We do that, I think, from the ground up, right? So some people, how do I know what I'm expressing, right? So sometimes that has to do with really, building awareness of my body is telling me this, and that means that I feel this. So we build that up depending, it helps a lot on the age group, on, developmental level, whatever the person is coming in with, and we assess individually and work on that. But really having opportunities for some of that freedom, some of that exploration that may not occur in a lot of other environments, because structure is so helpful and so almost necessary to success and development, right? So I would say self-expression, I think, is one that we really hold on to, because it's something that the arts, when people associate with the arts, that's something that we already talk about. Where words fail, music speaks. All of those little cringy signs you see at Target. Yeah, that's opportunities for self-expression. We want to have ways that people can feel heard and seen in a way that may not be traditional socially.
I completely agree with that. I think self-expression and autonomy is definitely the key ones. I think that social and self-awareness is also really important. With a lot of the groups I work with, that interaction through art is very important in being able to feel heard and listening to others while creating art with them. Whatever space that may be in a group setting, I think that social and self-awareness can both be established, where you are able to interact and appreciate and validate others in a creative space while also feeling that yourself. And that's done through all the modalities, and when you are able to recognize and interact with those in a way that involves other people outside of just the therapist in the room, that helps build that social awareness while also stimulating that self-awareness as well.
When I talk about motor planning and grasp, those are just two examples that I came up with for the increased fine and gross motor functioning, but that can look a lot of these things are accomplished without having to explicitly lay them out. It just naturally happens in the creative process, which is, I think, a really beautiful thing. So we talk a lot about, in music, for example, adapting music, adapting instruments to help support activities of daily living. That's a big challenge for a lot of people, so we want to support that in whatever way we can. So even though maybe the skill you're working on is holding a fork, holding a paintbrush might be a relatable skill. Holding a maraca, grasping a maraca versus grasping a cabasa, you don't have to know what all the technical instruments are, but being able to hold these different instruments and interacting them are going to target different fine and gross motor skills. Maybe we're playing the instrument with a single finger. Maybe we have them coming up, swinging all the way around and hitting the drum. We even have, I've had it before, where I'll put a tambourine on the ground and have them tap their foot on the tambourine. And then once they get comfortable with that, we start to add another instrument. So we're engaging these different body parts and working on, can I extend my leg, hit this instrument, and then kick out and hit the tambourine? How are we engaging some of those fine and gross motor skills in a little bit of an unconventional way? Oftentimes it looks very silly, but it can be a lot of fun. We do, we work a lot on that, I guess, again, drama and dance do this really well because it's very animated, right? Those happen very naturally in those spaces. I think a lot of us can kind of imagine how dance might engage the full body and that body awareness. But the same thing happens, I think, across even some of these modalities you might not traditionally think. The amount of times that, and I'll talk about this on my music slide, that we do, like, honestly, kind of like dance parties. We do a lot of, gross motor movement through music and dancing, because, like, who doesn't want to dance to a fun song? So a lot of these things, again, are approached in a way that almost doesn't feel like work. It's like secret therapy. I mean, obviously we want the person to know they're receiving therapy, but it typically is a lot more engaging, which can be one of the biggest challenges is that buy-in, right? It's really hard, especially if working those muscles is painful or maybe underdeveloped. It can be really hard to motivate someone to come every week and work on those things. So if we can do it in a way that is appealing and engaging and engages the interest of the client, then we're going to have a lot more success that way. And I've seen that again and again. Kids that have been absolutely resistant to some of the other traditional therapies, and they've come in and just had fun. So that's one of the things that I just want to kind of touch on. And again, these are all very individualized, whether we're working on talking about coping skills in a very literal way, or whether it's my body feels this, and so I'm going to just go to town on the drums for a few minutes, and now I feel calm. And, comparing that before and after. I have literally had a young child who could not self-regulate. She was screaming for about almost 2 hours. Finally, the teacher was like, I can't. She's like, I can't take it anymore. Like, I'm getting dysregulated. So I took the kid into the room, and I laid out all the drums we had. And after about 20 minutes, she just went to town for 20 minutes. She started to slow down. You could see she was wearing herself out. Eventually, she stopped, took a deep breath, and laid her head down and fell asleep. She just literally tired herself out. She did not throw anything. She did not hurt anyone. It was a safe container for her to just let out all of this energy that she just could not find another avenue to express. Yes?
What did you do during that 20 minutes?
I shared the space with her. I think one of the most powerful things a therapist can do sometimes is just be a witness and be a support. I didn't say anything.
Earplugs?
Yeah, I do have those. I'll be totally honest, I do have earplugs in my bag. But it's also, sometimes it's just sitting with it, sharing a space. I think a lot of clients, when we're singing, when we're making a lot of noise, that is traditionally an environment that, like, maybe mom and dad doesn't want to hear that 24/7. So if we can provide a space, even for an hour, where I'm comfortable witnessing that with you, and hey, I might join in. Depending on the client, I might also scream and dance with you. Then it's a different kind of environment. But in that case, I really just sat with her and just made sure she was safe with herself and with the material until she truly tired herself out. So
I think mirroring and joining in with them too is something I do often, where I have a lot of kids that are very physical, very active, whether it's with clay, and we have a big art room that is a disaster, I might add, given that clay is getting thrown at the walls often. I will throw clay at the walls with them, and it's giving them and validating a space where it's like, if you want to express yourself in this way, as long as you're not hurting yourself or others, there's no shame involved. If this is what you need and this is what your body needs, let's do it.
Yeah, the last example I'll give, I was co-treating with a dance movement therapist. And I don't care if you're neurotypical or neurodivergent. We get mad. There are things that, like, sometimes you're just really mad. So what we did is we took these like squishy balls, and literally I said, what music just like makes you angry? And she's like, Metallica. I was like, okay. So we blasted Metallica, and for literally 40 minutes, she just chucked the ball at the wall. And as she started going, you could just like see it like simmering. So I was like, how about we start to like make a noise with each throw? So she just started screaming every time she threw. It was the most visceral, like cathartic thing I've ever witnessed. She had really severe shoulder pain for a lot of her life. And now this is more of a trauma background, so we do work a lot with that mental health piece as well. She came in the next week. She said, I've been going to PT for years working on this shoulder. And she said, after I threw that last week, she's like, I've been able to move my arm in a way I have not been able to move it in 15 years. It was we talk a lot about emotion buildup. Our body holds on to different chemicals, and it can create physical discomfort. And so we provide opportunities that may look a little atypical in outside of that environment. But we literally just threw balls at a wall for an hour and screamed. It's actually really fun, but it looks a little different than you might think. So one of the biggest things that we're gonna jump into next is sensory integration, which is a term that I have up here that I'm gonna break down. Well, yeah, I saw that. It's okay. So, not to quiz you all, you didn't come here to go to school, but how many senses do we have?
6.
Okay, 6, 5. Okay, I see a lot of 5s, okay? So, we have vision, right? We have visual, we have our sight. We have this is always a fun term, like gustatory, like, I don't know. But taste, okay? Tactile, we have our touch, olfactory, smell, and then auditory, right? Those are the 5 that we all know and love. So whoever said 6, it's actually 7. I see a couple people know my secret, so it's less fun. But so we actually have 2 more that are often not talked about. One of them is called proprioception, and one of them is vestibular. So proprioception talks a lot about body awareness. It's the awareness of your body moving through space. I see this a lot with kiddos who really like to swing. It's that motion of moving back and forth is such a regulating feeling for them because they can literally feel themselves grounded and moving through space. That vestibular is more about balance. So if you think about proprioceptive as like how you relate to the outside, vestibular is more of how your body is relating on the inside. So that's going to be more of like balance. You see that a lot also when we're working on fine and gross motor skills. So those 2 are ones that relatively newer as we're developing, because we all knew the 5, right? So the cool thing is that through the arts, we engage all 7. We often refer to this as sensory integration, which is essentially we're targeting these areas very intentionally. Not so much taste, although the amount of kids that probably eat your art materials.
I was going to say, taste often is non-intentional, and a lot of the tactile material we make sure it's non-toxic, and sometimes make it with pudding slime is a big hit.
You never know. But I think especially, I think art can speak so much to how it engages in the traditional 5, of course, but of course the additional 2 as well. But it's targeting those because the more information that our body is receiving, the easier it is for us to assist them in organizing that information in a helpful way, right? It's like when you Google something and they give you like the quick like AI version of the answer versus like actually reading the article. So the more information we give, we as the therapist can then support the client in organizing that information to be helpful to them. Whether that, most of the time when I use this with music, a lot of times it's more about body regulation and keeping our body feeling grounded. So we're using, a lot of you maybe have heard about like the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So like 5 things you can see, 4 things you can hear, 3 things you can touch. Like trying to think through like 1 thing you can taste. So a lot of that is, doing activities that are going to engage the senses so that our bodies can feel more grounded in order to engage in another activity. If you want to talk about it, keep talking.
Yeah, and I think that you covered most of the sensory integration too. I think it's vary that proprioception and vestibular too is the two big ones that often get missed that Trisha already pointed out, but that body awareness is really big, especially within art and how we engage with art material, where I think a lot of people associate it with music, with movement, excuse me. That body awareness, I think, goes a lot with the kinesthetic senses and with clay that we're working with, and even with paint and a lot of those strokes that we make on a large piece of paper, the size of the paper we make. I do have a client that when we engage with paint, her emotions that she expresses is very much associated with what color choice she makes, and she will begin to paint her arms that color, and it stimulates a lot. And instead of coming at it from a shame in that, oh, there's this giant mess we are going to have to clean up, it stimulates a conversation with her that is associated with, wow, it seems like we have a lot of big feelings today. And going into why that color choice represents, I painted my arms red because I'm angry. That seems like a lot. What are we angry about today? What happened since the last time I saw you? And being able to paint her arms is very grounding for her as well, in that sensation and that tactile sensation, that body awareness, and being able to express it through her body awareness, and that you can see me, this is the color I am feeling, is a huge breakthrough in a lot of sessions we have that gives her a voice and gives her the recognition and validation that she desperately needs in session that she's not receiving outside of session.
If you have a hard time connecting the olfactory one, you can always, the smell. You can just think about how nostalgic a smell of crayons is. That's what I'm like, yes, I feel calmer now.
And the smelling markers too.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Just don't eat them. Also not toxic. So we've kind of hit on, some of the broader ways in which we approach this, but the other thing that I think is really important is the, delivery model, right? Are we seeing the individual or the group? We work extensively at our facility personally with both. We, like Nolan said, he's done a lot of group work. A lot of us work in private therapy as well, and so the way that we're going to approach treatment is going to be different depending on, obviously, if you're seeing one person versus up to 13, sometimes more than that. So I'll talk a little bit about individual, I'll throw group over to Nolan, but the cool thing about individual work is that ability to personalize it to a preference, right? We talk in music therapy a lot about client-preferred music. As much as it's good to get exposure to things that you're unfamiliar with, it's kind of almost like a would you rather of, listen to classical music that like maybe bore you, or listen to something that like gets you excited, right? It's something that we want the client to feel seen, but we also want them to feel invested in what we're doing. And so if they can bring something that's personal to them and invest that into what we're doing, it's a lot more fun, but it's also just a lot more engaging. So we do a lot of personalization, whether that be music preference, whether that be art medium, whether that be the song choice too comes across a lot in dance movement therapy, whether the narrations that they're creating through the drama, collaboration and treatment with team and family. So when the great thing about working with an individual is that we have so many more opportunities to target that treatment team. So for every single client that I see, as comfortable as the parent or family is, I am in contact with all of the other providers that they see, and we are in communication regularly about what is it that you're working on, what are you seeing, is it the same as what I'm seeing? It's great because that's the time where I can see, well, that's interesting, because when we do that in music, this is how she responds. Versus, it's really good to know that we're working on that traditional grasp, so I can go ahead and target that as well and support the work that you're already doing. Also seeing things that happen at home. Again, I'm a very relational, humanistic therapist, so when I work with a family, I want to know if a family member just passed away, that's really important. Because maybe a person is coming in really dysregulated and they don't have the words to tell you why, and they may be even acting in a way that they don't quite understand, but all we know is that something bad happened and my body doesn't feel good. So if I can get that insight from the family, it's going to give me a lot more context for how to come about regulation. Individual input on treatment goals. I absolutely 100% of the time, as much as I can, try to involve the client in the development of their treatment goals. That comes a little bit with that humanistic perspective, but very much it's your treatment. What is it important that you work on? Obviously, that might change a little bit. Maybe mom and dad have a different idea of what's important to work on, so we do try to provide space for both. But if a person thinks that their number one goal is to work on anger management, then that's going to be a priority to me, because we want them to be invested in the work they're doing. Nobody likes to be mandated to go to therapy, so if they feel that they're working with you, that treatment is going to go a lot smoother. It's typically more client directed, so we talk about directives a lot. So sometimes I come in, and often I leave this to the client too, of, are you a person that responds really well to structure? Do you want every session to start with a hello song, then move to this, then move to this? Or are you someone that, like, you get structure all the time and you want chaos, and that's okay? It's going to depend on the client, and so we have that freedom to be as flexible as we need to be. And then, of course, with individual treatment, typically it's long-term. Usually it's, if we do have termination, it's either client-driven or it's because they don't need us anymore. And the ultimate goal of all of the therapies, hopefully, is that eventually you won't need us, because you have the skills, you have the autonomy, you have the ability to do it on your own. So, we see, obviously, termination can also happen because someone moves or et cetera, but it's more of that long-term treatment. We have clients at our facility. I have one right now. She is 36. She has ACC, and she has been working with ITA since she was 7. So she's been consistently engaged in music therapy and art therapy for almost her entire life. And it's been one of the most consistent therapies that she's ever had. A couple different therapists over the time, obviously, but some of these clients have been in it for the whole journey.
And that goes with groups as well. We have a lot of established groups that have been in ITA and established by ITA for a very long time. And that kind of ties into the point at the bottom of inherent flexibility, as many of those group members change over time, and it's important to hold a space to go over that flexibility and to validate some of the feelings that come with new group members coming in and out. That can be a really big challenge for a lot of members that have been established with the group for a long time. It's tough losing a friend and someone that you can hold a sustainable conversation in and be vulnerable in front of, that isn't just your therapist. It also includes preferences for all the group members involved. It can be a challenge, but also a great opportunity for distress tolerance to hold a space where multiple people have input and multiple people have needs. While we do tailor a lot of our creative groups to members that have similar diagnoses or similarities in their experiences in life, because that can establish like a really safe space in order to share very vulnerable things, that distress tolerance also comes with it, where we're not categorizing every person in the group as the same thing with the same needs, same goals. Each individual is their own person with their own experience. So being able to hold those discussions of, maybe this week it's not what is ideal for you and what is something that can be difficult to sit with. Maybe we can have a discussion with all the other members and how we can meet your needs and the needs of everyone else through art making or while art making. That art making in a group space is often a funnel for attention and grounding, that verbalization comes while group members are doodling, creating art, working with clay, painting. That verbalization and that vulnerability and emotional expression can be stimulated and driven while your attention is in something else, instead of just facing a therapist or facing all the other members in the group. That can be really overwhelming for a lot of them. Collaboration with other group members and the faculty that you are with. A lot of groups that I do work with are in residential homes, school settings that we do CPS with, inpatient facilities. Collaboration and working with those already established employees of whatever facility you're at gives you a lot of insight and information on who you're working with, and just make sure that you're upholding safety and a safe space for them to thrive in and meet those therapeutic goals. Broad group-based goals, I think, are definitely a lot more challenging, at least in my personal opinion, than the individualized goals, because that working with and collaboration with each individual group member can be difficult if the goals are so different, which is why we try to tailor our groups to have members that are at least similar in experiences. But it tailors these goals to peer engagement, collaboration, verbalization, emotional expression, more broad-based that are more easily accessible and are more tailored toward group spaces. Treatment is usually time-bound, so most of the time, like Trisha said, we want therapy to end at some point and for them to be sustainable and autonomous. But groups are especially time-bound, and there is an end to this within a few weeks. I only have a few groups that ITA specifically holds that have been going on for years, but then that also leads into flexibility with members leaving and joining. Those groups that aren't time-bound and that there isn't a set number of weeks and we are done, that flexibility becomes a big part. And those members that have been there for 3 years and someone new comes in, it can feel like an invasion of a space where and having those conversations of, why are you here? What do you bring to the group? I feel threatened that you are invading my space. It's important to discuss those, and also in a creative way that doesn't promote shame within the group, where we want to be inviting to these people that can have valuable experiences and can help sustain conversation within the group, but not in a shameful way where it feels too territorial for new members to join.
So we're really passionate about this topic, and we've talked a lot. So I know we put a lot of examples into this, so we might skim past this a little bit. But before we move in, I want to make sure we hit some of the end things as well. Is there any questions? We went over a lot of content about the sensory piece, application, foundations. Any questions about the section we just did? Go ahead.
In general, I'm interested in hearing about in the instance of the ACC, right? Knowing, since you have the experience, let's say the goal was social and self-awareness. Could you talk a little bit about some case studies in a way that is safe, obviously, for professional purposes, but just to hear a little bit about that process, the evolution, before and after, and or continuing, just.
Yeah. So the question was about, providing an example of working with someone with ACC. So the individual that I work with has pretty profound disability. So they are non-speaking. They are also a wheelchair user. That being said, music is one of the only things that mom has really held on to over the years in terms of consistency over the lifespan, because of how much genuine enjoyment her daughter gets from it. So, it's really interesting. We figured out over time that she has a heavy preference for 80s music, which I'm all for, because if I can listen to Africa every week, I'm cool with that. So, what we do in a session, I think it's really interesting because, again, it's very personalized. So her treatment has definitely evolved over time. We don't talk. I do sing with her, but she does vocalize. I like to use the term non-speaking because I have a lot of kiddos that have no verbal language, but they communicate just fine. So, what she does is she does a lot of and so I'll vocalize with her and do improvisation. Basically, it's like creating meaning from what maybe you and I might think is nonsensical language. For some clients, we're actually able to take that and produce beginning speech sounds and build off of that to create new words. We do a lot of working on some of those vowel sounds and things. For her, it's a lot more just opportunities for self-expression. So she might make a vocalization, and I'll pick up my guitar and echo it back to her. She might make a different sound, I'll echo it back to her. It's a type of validation that might not occur in a different setting. We also do a lot of tactile engagement as well. She has a difficulty self-regulating. She has very limited upper body mobility. So I use, it's a kabasa. So essentially it's an instrument that has beads around the outside, and we run it up and down her arms and her back and her, it's a kind of a cold metal feeling, but it's really calming. And so it's ways of, giving her some sensory input on parts of the body that are typically just stuck in a chair. It's also, just that enjoyment that we talk about quality of life a lot, right? So regardless of who you're working with, the arts just has an element of I guess, enjoyment and beauty that kind of is absent in a lot of other cases. We're not sure how much she can see because she can't tell us. So, you know, I know that she can hear though because, you know, I put on her favorite song and she just lights up. And so what we do is we give her 2 instruments. I usually do some sort of like a loud clanging drum and like a shaker, so very contrasting. And I'll play, so do you want to play the drum or the shaker? And she'll usually like tilt her head or like smile when she finds an instrument she likes. And so we'll pick that one up and we'll help her keep the beat with hand-over-hand assistance to one of her favorite songs. So it's a lot of just kind of working with the preference and taking the time to learn the person so that you can honor their individuality, but also just like have a good time. So, you know, we're working on some of those skills in terms of speech development. She is a little bit later on, you know, she's been in therapy for a long time. She likely will never verbalize words, but, you know, we give her opportunities to make meaningful vocalizations. So that's just, you know, that's one example. And I work with some other clients too that it's been really incredible to see. You know, I had one mom say, you know, like the OTs basically gave up on us. Like they basically said, like, she's never gonna get better than this. Like, there's no reason to keep coming. And so she stayed with music therapy. This is another client that's been with us for over 2 decades. And the OT who said that she wasn't ever going to be able to hold something on her own, this is a client who, when I put a song on, now if you ask her to just hold it, she'll drop it. But if you put her favorite song on, she will hold a mallet and play on rhythm with me. She's also someone that will independently reach out and play the cue chord or the keyboard with me. So, you know, these are people that they just needed that extra engagement with the neurological support too of that connectivity in order to complete that task. And, you know, her mom is just like, she's like, I can't imagine not doing music therapy. She just loves it, but also she's doing things that they told me she would never be able to do. So I think that's, you know, some of the examples that I have when working with this population, and you know, it's been really, I think, meaningful for the parents, but I hope, and they can't tell me because both of those clients, you know, are non-speaking, but it's just, I don't know, something about them coming in and just like lighting up, like, oh, it's music, like you can just like, it's your time. What do you want to do? Yes.
I have an off-the-cuff kind of question, but do you find, maybe you're not the right person to ask, but do you find that therapies like this are funded through private, like health insurance policies? Are they private pay? Do you know what that looks like? Is a physician's order required to get it paid through your health insurance policy and those types of things?
Yeah, so the challenge is that it varies state to state. In general, so for example, not to speak for you, but some of the creative arts, like art therapy, are typically covered by insurance, especially with like a counseling license. A lot of us are dual licensed for the insurance piece. But in some states, for example, it's covered by Medicaid. In some states, it's covered by all insurance. In some states, it's not, and so it's financial aid. Unfortunately, it really varies state to state. Typically, even with that Medicare or the Medicaid piece, I will say that oftentimes, even in states that aren't covered, you can like submit like an appeal, and they will typically cover us. It's growing. Depends on the modality, and it depends on the state, unfortunately. Yes.
To add to that, what is like typically the going rate? I know it's gonna depend on state, but what is it? You guys are from Illinois, correct?
Yes.
Yeah.
What is the going rate?
So the question is, what is the typical rate? It's going to depend between group and individual. Do you know what the current?
So individual for ITA, I want to say is 120 per therapeutic
I think it's
hour.
140 now.
It may be 140 now, and
Yeah.
and then I think for group we also have financial assistance too through ITA, where some groups we definitely give some individuals we give a much more discounted rate for.
Yeah.
I think group, they're depending on age, I think it can be anywhere from like 70 to 110. We also have an intern rate as well that I believe is 110. But through financial aid, it's because ITA is a nonprofit. We also there's a limited amount allocated per year, and so sometimes there's a wait list depending on financial aid available. And if those spots open up, we'll offer it to families that do need the financial aid. And
They pay as little as like $9 a session.
yeah,
So it really depends. Really depends. It also depends on the credentialing of the therapist. Obviously, the more school we have to do, it tends to change the session rate a little bit. But we did a lot of examples going out. I want to just like skip through really quick. We are at the table out in the exhibit hall. If you want to hear more client stories, I'm happy to share them. I could talk about this all day. But I think the last thing I want to talk about is just supporting the support system. It's so much comes on the parents and the caregivers and the person themselves, right? So we really, really try to involve the parents as much as we can. Sometimes we also encourage supporting the parent, asking them to maybe even recommend them into therapy. We have some families that we see mom, dad, and both kids. So it's a great avenue for the parents as well, but also, just their involvement in treatment. We like to do parent sessions. I bring the individual that I have right now she's 13. Her mom comes in once a month and we do a family session. But we're also here for emotional support. We are, we're therapists, right? We also recognize how hard it is. I've put grief on here as well because I think society is rough. There's so many barriers that that even though your child is the most incredible human, that society might discount them in ways that is unacceptable. And it's hard because you're anticipating some of the challenges that are going to come their way. And so we're recognizing that and providing some space also for loss of opportunity, bullying, things like that. It comes up a lot. And so we try to connect with the parents as much as we can. It's a community. This conference, I think, is so phenomenal because it gives you guys opportunities to talk to people that understand what you're going through. We try to do that even in our own office. The amount of clients that have unintentionally become friends by just chilling in the lobby together and starting a conversation. It's a community of people that we bring together because they understand my kid struggles with that too. And here's how I work with it, here's how, and we also have that background too of I've worked with a lot of parents and, so-and-so found that this was actually a really helpful thing for them. We have a therapist that has an amazing collection of podcasts she can recommend, So we are aware that it is a family system, whether that be, whether that be a positive relationship with the family or maybe it's a tense one. And that's where we try to give a lot of autonomy to the client too, to say, I don't need mom and dad to be involved in this part, and that's okay. So providing some of that space in psychoeducation and just also empowering the individual to take power in their own work. So.
And the resources available to send them to other places if need be as well, where sometimes there's resources in community building in support groups that while ITA doesn't have necessarily the space to hold those support groups, there's so many available ones in the area that we make sure as an organization to keep up to date on resources that are available to those that are seeking it or may need it for support groups outside of the therapy session that we hold.
Last piece was, as we're finishing up, we talked about this throughout. We work really well with complementary fields as well. We collaborate a lot at our agency because we're very privileged to have all of the modalities all together all the time. So I can just be like, hey, Nolan, what do I do with this? But with related fields, I've done a lot of co-treating with, speech language pathology, a lot of PT as well. They are the experts in their field, and we are definitely not trying to, to fix language. But how can I use music to support what you're working on so that we can be together and be on the same page and be that support system? So, we're always happy to build that treatment team, and they tend to work really well together. So, sorry we had to rush through the end. We're really excited about this topic. But any final questions as we're closing out? Yes.
So we're a drummer family at Grantham Manor. So I play drums, and my neurotypical son is in middle school percussion, so he's playing a lot of different stuff. And so my DCCer is 9 years old, and he loves music and the drums and all that. Is there something that ITA
So the question was, how could you use percussion in this instance to, stimulate that brain activity? And I guess the major thing that I will say is just be aware of any sensitivities. So if he does have auditory, give him some headphones, and allow for exploration. So it helps to let them come to you and come to that instrument and just explore a little bit. I wouldn't typically go straight to the music education piece on like 8s and 8s, but just like, let's start with, have him explore with one hand. Okay, he's getting pretty good with that, pretty comfortable with that. Maybe let's throw in another drumstick and see what we can do. I think it's about the expectations and just like the image of, you're not necessarily teaching him to play the drums. If that is a possibility in the future, absolutely. But from a foundational knowledge of just, let's have fun, let's explore, and then build from there.
I think the only reason why I was thinking about, doing 4s in one hand, 4s in the other hand, and things like that is just because he seems pretty decent at it.
Yeah, I mean, like, hey,
I do it, my dad's a drummer,
you can always build up. You can always increase the challenge, but,
Yeah, and then just with working both hands too, it's just, I know that would probably be a challenge, because he doesn't have, he has a little piece of his corpus callosum at the very front, but, I mean, we all know, who knows what that's
Yeah.
doing. May not be doing anything, may just be there, but the rest of it's gone. So just trying to get those, the brain waves going
Yeah.
back and forth, and just,
honestly, just engaging in music is already going to stimulate. Whether or not it will, do anything grand and amazing, it's hard to say, but, that stimulation is still important. All right, thank you all. Like I said, we're around, so if you have more questions, please feel free to reach out to us. We're happy to keep talking forever. So thank you guys.
Thanks, y'all.